Hi everyone. Today we'll have the first lecture in a series of lectures that we have to the rest of this semester. So before we begin talk about the topic of today, I want to go over a few important things. First of all, in order to make this maybe a little bit more relaxing platform, so I will replace this disgusting background of my office you see in the back to something a little bit more relaxing, maybe I say, and there it is. So now you can see some relaxing snow background. I don't know if it helps, but if you have suggestions for something more relaxing, that you're more than welcome to talk to me and let me know. Send me an email, and I will do my best to do that. Just don't do anything crazy with these pictures behind me. In a more serious note, just reminding you a couple of things we need to remember before talking about the topics of today. First of all, I remind you the attendance procedure. In order to ensure that you get your attendance grade for any lecture, in every one of the lectures, I will give you one word, which will be the attendance word of the day. That's going to be today when I get to the last 5 minutes of the lecture. I will stop and I'll give you the attendance word of the day. What you need to do is to send me an email by the end of once you finish watching the video, you send me an email and tell me what was the attendance word of the day. This way I will mark you as I will mark that you have watched the video and your attendance grade should be fine. You will get the slides later today on eCampus, just like I did on every regular class before everything here began. Finally, you need to let me know your decision regarding the final paper. So by this Friday, March 27th, I want to get an email from each and every one of you telling me who you're going to be working with for the final paper and the presentation, and second, what is the case that you chose to study, what terror incidents over the last 10, 15 years, it doesn't have to be from the US, it can be from everywhere in the world, you want to study in your final paper. So please make sure that you send it to me by Friday. Okay, so in order to begin our topic of today, I will share my screen with you so we can start. All right, so today we will talk about the political and social effects of terrorism. Now, since I want to keep the lecture format the way it was before moving to the online class as much as I can, I will start with a quick review of our last topic, which was a long time ago, at the beginning of March. So we talked about the political effects of terrorism. How does terrorism affect voting preferences? We focused on the paper by Getmansky and Zaitov. We studied rocket launching as a terror method. The focus on rocket launching was intended mostly to study the effect of being under the threat of terrorism, not just being the direct victim of terrorism. And just living under this threat, I showed you all the videos, what it means living under those conditions, how that impacts the political preferences of the population. The study was, of course, focused on Israel and provided more evidence for valence theory, reminding you again, more support for the right-wing bloc, because the right-wing bloc is seen as more competent to deal with this kind of threat. Then we talked a little bit more about voter turnout. How does terrorism affect turnout? Does it increase or decrease turnout? People go to vote more because of terrorism or less? So based on an emotional reaction of either anxiety or anger, we actually found and we showed that there's evidence that turnout is actually increased because of terrorism, mostly because it makes the issue of national security, the issue of terrorism more salient, so the public is more willing to invest more in terms of going to the polls and vote in order to address the threat. The last topic we talked about was the survival of governments. How is terror attacks impact the likelihood of government survival, especially coalition governments? The main mechanism that I've talked about was the role of coalition government, alternative government, and what does terror attacks the effect of terror attacks in this whole combination of factors. So the whole argument was that when it was right-wing government, then the effect of terrorism is less likely, because the alternative government, a left-wing government, is seen as less competent of dealing with this kind of threat. On the other hand, the left-wing government is more likely to fail because the alternative, a right-wing government, is seen as more competent. And the data actually supports those kinds of propositions. If you have any questions regarding these topics, then you're welcome to email them to me, of course, and I will answer whatever that is. Today, we keep talk about the effects of terrorism on the public, the targets of terrorism, focusing more on psychological and social effects. So most of the studies in this research address questions regarding the relationship between terror incidents and all kinds of various psychological and social factors. And most of those studies provide evidence that relates to public support for certain policy preferences in order to address the threat of terrorism. So we will focus on 3 different puzzles, just like we did when we did the political effects of terrorism. The first is terror and threat perceptions. So different types of threat perceptions and what exactly are the factors that shape those threat perceptions. And then we'll go more to psychological mechanisms focusing on negative emotions, both anxiety as well as anger. But before we go deeply into each one of those puzzles and talk about specific papers, I want to talk more generally about the psychological aspect of terrorism. So the efficacy of terrorism, the terror as an effective political contention method is very much dependent on psychological effects, right? Terror needs to be able to elicit or to generate those psychological reactions from their targets, from the public, in order to make terrorism effective. And one thing that the researchers are agreeing upon is on those psychological effects. We have talked about a lot that there's a lot of disagreements between scholars about the effects of terrorism, whether it is the critical approach that I presented to you, the contrast between the strategic approach and the organizational approach. But one of the things there is a very relatively wide consensus about between scholars is that the psychological effects of terrorism and how strong they are. Now, within this psychological effect, one of the things is that one of the agreed upon aspects is that the target audience is not just the victims of the attacks themselves, but the larger audience that the terrorists are trying to make the effect on in terms of their political effect. And threat perceptions are one of those main mechanisms that is studied by social scientists. It's just not just political scientists, or all psychologists are studying that. In sociology, there's studies that focusing on threat perceptions and similar aspect to this. So overall, there's a couple of more general findings regarding the prevalence of threat perceptions. First of all, it tends to increase intolerance and xenophobia, and as well as prejudice. Mostly all those are focusing on the outgroup, which represent the threat. Those threats can be either to the status of the group, status that we are facing due to terrorism, or the resources that are under threat because of terrorism. In terms of the behavior of elite decision makers, such as government members or other types of leaders, they tend to be much more dogmatic and tend to emphasize a negative view of the adversaries, which again represent the threat. Overall, the threat is seen as an external threat, which means there's a much more greater outgroup bias and a stronger solidarity for the in-group. So we are more closer to each other because we are under threat, and we are distancing ourselves as much as possible from the outgroup, which represents the threat itself. All right, so despite the prevalence of threat perception to explain public views and preferences, there's some authors that actually note that other kinds of emotional, psychological factors also impact those reactions. And that actually may lead to different prediction in terms of how terrorism shapes public reactions. And one of the central other emotional reactions here is anxiety. There are 3 aspects that distinguish between anxiety and perceived threat. First of all, anxiety tends to harm cognitive capacity since it diverts our attention to the threatening stimuli, increases our cognitive preoccupation with those threatening sources. So that's going to harm any kinds of very basic tasks such as reading and even word recall. That's the effects of anxiety. When the events are personal, and relevant to the individual, there's a much higher degree of anxiety as well as risk perception in this case. And when there's high degree of risk aversion because of this anxiety, then from a behavioral standpoint, what happens is that because of those high degree of risk perception, we tend to behave in a more risk averse way, to take acts that are intended to reduce this anxiety. Okay, so but even though we have those distinctions between anxiety and perceived threat, they are both enhanced when the experience is much more personal. Why? Because it's making those ideas, exactly as it says here on the slide, it's making morality and vulnerability much more pronounced. So this is generally the distinction between anxiety and perceived threat. You may remember that I said that 9/11 was seen as a watershed moment for research on terrorism. It provided access, mostly because it provided access to a lot more data, because the United States was under attack. There was a lot of access to talk with the public in order to test a lot of those theoretical propositions. And so they will have a lot more data to test our theories. One of the things that was tested was emotional reactions to terrorism. Focusing in this case, the study we talked about here, that was on your syllabus for today's lecture, was the Hari et al., which was a 2005 paper. They focused on emotional responses as anxiety as well as a perceived threat and how it translates to certain policy preferences. So they did a survey using phone interviews of about 1,500 participants. You see the timelines, it's on the slides, between October 2001, right after the attack, until some point in March 2002. One of the things that they wanted to do was to distinguish between threat perception and anxiety. As I showed you in the previous slide, there are some propositions about the difference between those two reactions, and they wanted to test whether it can be actually measured. So they used different questions in their surveys, such as these. For example, you can see the first question is, how concerned are you that there will be another terror attack? Is a more general question. But if you look at the third point here, as you think about the attacks on the US, how often have you felt anxious, scared, or worried? So it's a much more targeted question in order to test this proposition of anxiety versus threat perception. What they did in terms of the method that they used to test those questions, they use what's called factor analysis. Factor analysis is a method that allows us to estimate a latent, underlying common aspect, and whether there's actually a series of questions in a survey that tap into the same mechanism. And what their results show, that indeed those questions were able to show them using the factor analysis that indeed anxiety and threat perception are actually two different reactions based on the terror effect. An additional analysis that they did was trying to identify what are the determinants of those two different reactions. So what are the individual level determinants that lead to anxiety? What are the individual or contextual factors that lead to perceived threat? Are they the same factors or different factors? Yeah, different factors impact those two reactions. So first of all, there's a couple of common factors. Gender, for example, females are more likely to experience higher degree of anxiety as well as higher degree of perceived threat. Education level is also related to that. Those who have higher degree of education are less likely to perceive high degree of anxiety. But at the same time, they also showed, in terms of those individual determinants, that there's also differences. Why? Because age was much more prevalent for threat perception and less for anxiety. Older people were actually less anxious. At the same time, partisanship was another finding. The Republicans showed much less degree of anxiety compared to non-Republicans. One of the interesting factor was proximity. So they differentiated between temporal proximity, so that means how close is the attack to the time that we talk, to the time that we make the survey, as well as spatial proximity. What is the location of the people that we are asking those questions? So in terms of the temporal proximity, it was common for both for the anxiety as well as the perceived threat. The further away that we get from the attack, the individuals felt less anxious and their threat perception was actually reduced. The more interesting one is the spatial proximity. And in the slides you can see here, it stands for Northeast. So those who residents of the Northeast have higher threat perceptions, But in terms of anxiety, it was those that live in the New York area, which was much more anxious. And that comes back to the previous slide where it mentions that the personal experience emphasizes those kinds of reactions. So those who live in the New York area, they had a much more personal experience of the 9/11 attacks, showed higher degrees of anxiety. Okay, so the second, after we established that anxiety and threat are actually two different reactions to terrorism, we want to ask, and that's what another question that they asked in this paper, does this have an effect for different policy preferences, for different behavioral aspects? So they asked different types of policy-related questions. The first question they asked was related to foreign policy, and they showed actually there are differences in terms of those emotional reactions and policy preferences by the public. So those who displayed high threat perceptions actually were more likely to support military retaliation in response to 9/11. At the same time, those who expressed high degree of anxiety were less supportive of that, mostly because they were afraid for further reprisal against the United States. So as you can see, we have here two different psychological reactions to terrorism, and those actually have different prediction in terms of how they affect policy preferences by the public. Another question they asked was related to support for the president. At that time, it was President George W. Bush. So those who experienced high degree of threat perception were more supportive of President Bush. And this can mostly be related to the fact that his response to the terror incident was centered on military action. So as you can see at the top of the slide, those with higher threat perception supported military retaliation. They also had higher support for President Bush. And the results that they get in this paper, the analysis is corresponded with some of the national polls that were conducted at the time. Some of the polls showed that there was over 90% approval for Bush handling of the crisis and about 72% support for military reactions. And those figures in terms of the survey data represent what you can see on the slides here called the rally effect, which is facing a threat of large proportion, the public tends to rally behind the leader. So there's a large extent of support for President Bush based on the how large was the threat of 9/11. One thing we need to remember about this rally effect, that it's prevalent in many of those studies related to conflicts and a lot of wars. At the same time, it's usually short in terms of its duration. So there is a very short rally effect support for the leader, and once the conflict prolongs, it tends to reduce. Okay, so we know now that emotional reactions such as anxiety or threat perception has different effects based on terrorism, and they may lead to different policy preferences. Let's try and test what other types of political aspects related to terrorism are based on those psychological mechanisms. So one of them, sorry, there you go. One of them is that the support for the right-wing governments, we know that terrorism, increased support for right-wing government is based on anxiety. So this is kind of a logic that is based on the idea that security concerns because of terrorism are part of the explanation. And a lot of members of the media are emphasizing that. Politicians are trying to enhance their support for right-wing government based on anxiety. But the paper that I want to talk about now is this Vasilopoulos paper from last year. They actually offer an alternative view. They argue that the driving emotion behind this political effects and behind this support for a right-wing government is actually anger. Their main mechanisms, according to their study, is based on elites. Elites raise those concerns about the threats, that they're blaming all kinds of groups which are external groups, again, outgroups, which are disliked because they violate social norms by engaging in terrorism. In this paper, they are using what's called AIT, which is affective intelligence theory. It's a psychological theory which argues that human reaction to stimuli is, in this case, it's information about the threat of terrorism, can lead to multiple emotional reaction. In this case, it can be anxiety as well as it can be anger. So what their main argument is that emotions, the emotional reaction, whether it is anxiety or anger, in this case, interact. That means that it's either enhanced or it may reduce all kinds of already existing or predispositions such as partisanship, ideology, or authoritarianism. So what are they doing in the study? They're trying not only to show what exactly is anxiety does to our political preferences, to all kinds of predispositions, they're also trying to estimate mostly the effect of anger. So how do they do that? They use a regional election in France that took place in December 2015 to test it. These elections took place 3 weeks after the ISIS attacks that we saw on the videos that we showed, on the movie that we saw a couple of weeks ago. What they find is that the attacks invoke a higher degree of both emotions, but it actually had contrasting effects in terms of the anxiety versus anger on voting for right-wing parties. So their focus was how does anxiety versus anger affect this support for right-wing parties. So let's just look at some of those results. What we see here is the marginal effect. Oops, there you go. The marginal effects of the two different emotional supporting for the right wing, and what we see is those exactly contrasting effects. Higher degree of fear on the left-hand side, which is the indication of anxiety, reduce the support, the probability of support for right-wing parties. At the same time, as anger increases on the right-hand side of this slide, actually increases the support for right-wing parties. So this is exactly the opposite effect of those psychological, of those emotions on different predispositions. In this case, it is partisanship. They also studied more focusing on ideological predisposition. So again, on the left-hand side, we have the anxiety reactions. And as you can see, for left-wing parties, which is the blue line, and the red line, which is like center-left, the effect is almost non-existent. It actually has the strongest effect on the supporters of the far-right ideology. It reduces their extent of support when they're more afraid. But at the same time, the more angry they are, their extent of support gets higher. Those two figures show exactly the opposite effect of anxiety and anger on those predispositions. These results have further implication, mostly that it's increased the polarization. So when anger dominates the reaction of the people, then both sides of the political spectrum are actually each pulling for the other side. We saw that reaction also when I talked about the effects of terrorism in Israel. On the other hand, when fear is actually more powerful, that there is more attention to political issues and there's less partisanship in the vote choice. So the more anger the public is as a result of terror attacks, there's actually more polarization across society. So far, I've talked about distinction between threat and emotions such as anxiety or anger, and how are these two different emotions such as anxiety or anger have their own effect. So we know that terrorism threats can lead to those responses. Some of the responses may be fear and anxiety, some of them may be anger. Those have their own behavioral effects, such as some higher degree of intolerance and prejudice, rejection of threatening outgroups. One of the interesting questions in this context is what is the distinctions between those reactions? So what type of threat increase fear, while at the same time, are there different types of threat that increase the degree of anger? And that's the last study that I want to talk about for today. This is another study by Hadi and her associates. This is a study from 2002. And they asked this question: what distinguishes between those emotional reactions? And what they propose is that we need to conceptualize threat, which is, again, the source of those reactions, as two levels of terrorism threat. There's a personal threat and there's a national threat. The personal threat is a much more a threat to our physical nature, right? I feel like I'm under attack, so I'm much more concerned about terrorism. And national threat is a threat to the entire collective. All of us as a group, students of Texas A&M, all of us as a nation, everybody that lives in the United States is facing the threat of terrorism. The view of this kind of threat, a national threat, it tends to lead to what's called the morsalizing of politics, which means that our preference to address this issue is less with regard to our own personal stake. It means that we have to support a policy that's going to address the threat to all of us as a nation instead of just have a specific effect on me, the individual. So what I want to do is distinguish between personal and national threat. in order to test this proposition that there is two different types of threat and they have their own effect on different emotions, they use the data from the surveys that I talked about earlier in this lecture, the surveys that they conducted right after 9/11. They conceptualize a personal threat as arguing that terror incidents increase our own individual's degree of insecurity about whether we are going to be victims of this terror incident. It makes issues such as mortality much more salient. The emotional reaction, more likely in this case, is going to be fear and anxiety. And these emotional reactions have effect on our own behavior. It's going to change our behavior in ways that we're going to try to reduce the risk. One of the previous studies that they used to, in order to support that proposition or to just generate this proposition, in studies that conducted data about surveys back in the 1980s, showing that people that had higher degree of crime in their neighborhood changed their behavior. For one example is that they stopped walking around at night because they were fearful from the effect of those crimes. So the distinction between those two types of threats and how they lead to different reactions leads to actually two competing predictions. Personal threat leads to a higher degree of fear, and in terms of policy preferences, that increase that we're more likely to support policies that going to reduce those fears. That means that we're going to support more defensive actions, such as more security in the airports and stuff like that. At the same time, most of the research shows that public views of government policy is mostly shaped by national types, our view of a threat to the entire nation. So they want to see whether those two threats are actually distinct, but mostly focusing on the context of terrorism. Now, it's impossible to say that those two types of threats are actually completely distinct because they have to be related on some level. A personal concern in this case is much more likely when there's also a national threat, because there's a national threat to all of us in the United States, then I may be more likely to fear for my own life because there is a threat of terrorism. They use the surveys that I've talked about already before in order to test whether those two types of threats are actually separate from another, but maybe they are related, again, using this factor analysis method. The sample was a little over 1,000 adults. This time they used data from a more restricted part of their sample, only collected during October and November 2001. So they use different items in their survey, and I can give you examples for those items. So look at those two items as an example. How concerned are you personally about yourself that you're going to be a victim of terror attacks? At the same time, this is a question that's focusing more on the personal threat. At the same time, questions such as how concerned are you that there will be another major attack? You're looking at the entire nation of the United States. So this is a more national type of threat. Again, they use factor analysis and they do find support for those two different types of attacks. At the same time, a further analysis that they did with their data showed that there's a relatively high degree of a correlation between both of those threats, which means, again, that personal threat is conditional upon those national threat, right? So we're not going to have a personal threat just like we thought about before we looked at the data because of terror incidents, unless there is a national threat. Now, before I move on to pretty much almost the last slide, I will stop here and give you, as I promised, the attendance word of the day. So the attendance word of the day is relax, which is fitting to the situation we're facing right now. So again, the attendance word of the day is relax. Please, once you finish viewing the video, send me an email with this word so I can mark your attendance. Coming back to Hadi and her associate, as I talked about in the previous paper of Hadi and her associates, one more question that they're addressing is what are those determinants of those two different types of threats? So they find a couple of common factors, especially gender, for example. Men are lower for both national threat and personal threat. Proximity at the same time increases threat perception. So the closer you are to the location of the threat, the more likely to experience both types of threats. At the same time, they found different effects for factors such as higher education. So those who have higher degree of education actually are less likely to experience personal threat. And the explanation for this finding is related to what's called understanding of base rates, and that's the more educated you are, you understand that the probability of actually being a victim of terrorism is very, very low. And I'll use that to throw all of us back into the first lecture that I had in this semester. You remember we talked about the numbers, and the likelihood of being a victim of a terror incident in the United States is a lot lower than 1. So in this case, again, by understanding what's called base rate, there is a difference, and we are less likely to feel a personal threat compared to a national threat. They also tested how those two types of threats affect behavior. They found that the personal threat is much more powerful in predicting actual behavior of individuals. These kinds of behavioral aspect is behaviors that are intended to reduce the risk. So people that experience higher degree of personal threat were more likely to be careful with their opening of their mail. Why? Because also reminding you that right after 9/11, there was also the anthrax scare of right after 9/11, and I'll talk about this a little bit more. So people are more careful with their mail. People are more likely to change their air travel plans because of personal threat. And national threat also has some effect on some of those contextual factors, but much more general one, and was more predictive in terms of policy preferences and not just individual behavior. Okay, so this is the first part of our discussion about the psychological effects of terrorism. I hope you find this form of lecturing interesting. I promise that it's going to be better the more we do it throughout the remainder of this semester. Send me any feedback that you have, any problems or related question that you may have. Reminding you one more time to send me the attendance so I can mark your attendance for today. And stay safe, stay home, and I will see you on Wednesday. Bye.